This terrifying event happened to my buddy Ben when we were in high school. We were also very close, so we frequently went out together. That day, Ben invited us to his house to play, but we were all so terrified to go. Just thinking about it gave me and my friends goosebumps. But when we heard that his family had recently purchased a new video game console, we forgot about our concerns. We were astonished and delighted to know that we would be able to play a new gaming console, so we immediately agreed and rushed each other to Ben's house. At the time, all of our families were farmers, and Ben's family was the wealthiest. His father frequently bought him many excellent toys. Ben even advised us on the way that we should approach his house through the rear entrance because some things might terrify us if we went in through the front door. I was concerned when I asked him whether his father slaughtered wild animals to soak wine. That was a little harsh. Hearing this, Ben voiced his disgust with my demeanor, stating that it was his father's profession, and that the more wild creatures that were drenched in alcohol, the higher the price they would sell for. Seeing that, we chuckled at the story and gradually entered Ben's house, and what made us not dare to go to Ben's house to play was his father, who worked as a brewer in a frightening style. The powerful odor of alcohol strikes the nostrils when the door was open, but something else drew my attention. It wouldn't be so frightening if Ben's father simply produced conventional wines, but he also produced wine from wild creatures. The wild animals were captured alive, placed immediately into the wine jar to drink the wine, and then drowned and perished, including snakes, pangolins, and monkeys. Ben's father even took owls and large geckos to soak in alcohol, and these wines were sold at exorbitant prices to the metropolis. After glancing around for a while, I got the impression that those wild white eyes were looking at me pitifully, which terrified me enough to close my eyes. But once we saw the gaming console, we forgot about our fears. We had a great time that day and nothing bad happened. That helped us gradually get used to it all and stop being frightened of it, so we began coming to Ben's house more often. That day after school, we went to his house again, and there were a lot of people in front of Ben's house, surrounding it. It turned out that Ben's father had captured a very huge cobra, and it appeared that he wanted to soak it in wine. It was the first time anyone had seen such a large snake, and it was found deep in the forest, so everyone was intrigued and drew it back to examine it. The cobra glared angrily at Ben's father, and everyone warned him to be cautious with large snakes like these. Then, as Ben and I went by, his father was ready to begin soaking the cobra in a jar of wine. Seeing everything made me a bit terrified, but then I started playing the game and forgot about the snake. Strange things began to happen all of a sudden. Ben's character froze and no longer moved. When I saw that, I turned to question him and saw Ben with his head down, making little coughing sounds. Then Ben's face turned purple and he coughed harder. His eyes were white and his mouth was full of water. He began to choke. His lips continued to spew something murky yellow, and I began to detect a strong alcohol odor from him. It turned out that what came out of his mouth was booze, not water. I became increasingly scared and I was at loss on what to do. Then Ben collapsed on the ground, his body splayed out as though lifeless. He was twisting and turning on the floor like a snake, wine still flowing out of his lips non-stop, and the image in front of me was horrifying. Ben appeared very weary after a time, laying on his back and motionless. I dashed to the yard to inform Ben's father because I was so terrified that I couldn't talk coherently. Ben's father had just finished soaking the snake at this point, so he was still quite pleased, and seeing me terrified, he had no idea what was going on. I was now staring at the snake in the wine jar. It looked just like Ben. It also extended its jaws wide. became white in the eyes, and twisted its body. This was precisely what Ben was experiencing in there. I didn't comprehend what was going on. My mind was a jumbled mess, and I simply stood there. Ben's father came inside to see what was wrong with his kid at this time, and I was still standing there in terror. Everyone rushed inside the house. Ben was nearly unconscious, with a lot of alcohol coming out of his lips. People surrounding Ben claimed he looked like a snake being drenched outside by Ben's father at the time. One of them also warned him that if he didn't release the snake, Ben would suffocate. When he heard that, he ran out of the yard and quickly knocked over the bottle of wine on the table, hoping Ben would live. The wine bottle shattered on the ground. Fortunately, the snake was still alive. It remained motionless for a while before waking up. It crept directly towards a pile of firewood to escape after calculating the direction. Everyone who watched the event that day, including me, was obsessed. Since Ben stopped vomiting as soon as the snake was freed, but did not wake up. Despite his father's efforts, Ben remained immobile. Seeing this, everyone urgently requested that his father bring Ben to the hospital in order to rescue him in time, as he was concerned that Ben would die if he continued to do so. Ben was classified as intoxicated at the hospital by the doctor because he drank too much alcohol. He slept for more than 2 days after that. I paid Ben a visit when he recovered consciousness and questioned him about what occurred that day and whether he remembered anything. Ben stated that while playing games as usual, he suddenly detected a strong odor of alcohol in his nostrils. Then, his entire body plunged into a large pool of wine. Struggling, but unable to swim, being further overpowered by alcohol. When he tried to look around, he discovered himself in a lake surrounded by translucent glass. When he looked out, he saw his father and many people laughing and pointing at him, as if Ben was shrinking. Ben felt the glass pane break just as he was ready to pass out from exhaustion and drowning in the water. Then I told him about the snake that his father had soaked in wine and left outdoors in the yard, looking precisely like what he had been doing that day. We were all terrified, Ben's father soon leaving the horror-brewing wine business too. This horrifying incident happened to a friend of mine named Taryn. That afternoon, I asked my mom to go to the field with my friends. Since it was during our summer holiday, my mom agreed to let me go with them under the condition that I had to return early for dinner. I instantly rushed outside with my friends. Taryn was waiting for me at the door. No sooner had I seen him than I asked what game we would play for the afternoon. Taryn told me that the group intended to go for frog hunting and pick mangoes from a tree near to an abandoned house. Taryn's mention of the abandoned house instantly scared me as our parents forbid us to go to it. But Taryn didn't show a fearful expression on his face as he told me he usually hunted frog around that area. Having finished his sentence, he ran away, leaving me standing in bewilderment. I hurriedly caught up with Taryn. As we made it to the place, we saw other kids hunting frogs in the bushes. However, oddly, there was not a single frog to be seen. Taryn told them to go further, as it would increase their chances of catching one. Then the boy courageously went to the direction of the house to our amazement. He used a stick to check on the ground and then carefully took a step forwards. At that time, I could see him heading to the abandoned house. We ignored Taryn and went to another area, playing mock combat. Before I left, I told Karen not to go near the abandoned house since it was a dangerous place. However, I was sure that he wouldn't have the courage to go near it. Taryn was annoyed to hear me joking on him being a scaredy cat. He said there was nothing in this world that would scare him. My friends and I bursted out laughing loudly as we heard his remark. Then we challenged him to go inside the house.
Taryn confidently told us that he would get inside the house and flip it upside down in our presence. Now all of us felt slightly scared. Was he really out of his mind? In order to prove his bravery, Taryn went near the house on his own. I slowly realized that my jokes had gone too far. Things had become more serious than I thought they would be. I couldn't let him go out like that. So we quickly followed him. Taryn was already at the door. He checked to see whether it was locked or not. Even though he didn't see the lock anywhere, the door was firm and not easy to break. Taryn told us that the door was likely to be locked inside or get rusted, which made it difficult for him to open. He said the house was safe, then told us to come closer and take a look inside. The calmness of Taryn's face made us become less scared as we walked towards the house. As we gazed through the windows, what was inside the house instantly terrified us. There was a pit of snakes slithering on the floor, looking creepy. The snakes were long and scary. They flicked their tongues and hissed at us. The scene appeared before our eyes made us tremble. We couldn't even stand still. Seeing me being fearsome, Taryn quickly made fun of me as revenge for being teased before. Taryn then did something truly crazy as he stuffed straws into a small hole through which the snakes had gotten inside the house. It turned out that he wanted to burn all of the snakes. His face was flushed with excitement as he lit a match and threw it to the straws. Taryn stepped backwards, watching the burn while the three of us were still in shock. The fire started getting bigger and bigger. Soon enough, the entire house was on fire as black smoke belched out densely. The snakes, unable to tolerate the heat, one by one slided out through the window. One of them wounded its way to Taryn. The boy unfearfully picked up a rock, then hit it to death while looking amusedly. His actions were brutal. All of us were shocked to see him acting like that. That night, as we had already returned home, when it struck midnight, my mom suddenly woke me up as she'd received terrible news. My parents and sister asked me where I'd been to this afternoon as Taryn had gone crazy. Meanwhile, many villagers were gathering in front of the house. I told my parents and my sister about the incident from the moment we walked to the abandoned house to when Taryn burned it down. My mom and dad decided to go to Taryn's house to inform his parents about the incident. Out of curiosity, I followed them. We saw a crowd gathering outside Taryn's house. There must be something really serious happening to him. I tried to gaze inside his house, then saw something really haunting. Taryn had been driven crazy. He held a stick in his hand, then hit it midair constantly, while yelling at something to go away. The boy looked like he had just seen a ghost. His face was terror-stricken. Taryn's mom was heartbroken to see her son like that. She tried to stop him. But Taryn didn't listen as he hit his mom with a stick in his hand. Those who were presented at the scene couldn't believe their eyes to see Taryn hitting his mother. He became more and more aggressive. Now the things that came to his sight were all horror. He saw hundreds of snakes winding their way to him. They all yawned, looking ferociously as if they wanted to eat him alive. The snakes then slithered all the way up his body. In just a few moments, Taryn was covered with them. Some even squeezed around his neck that made him breathe raggedly. Taryn waved for help. He kept shouting, but people couldn't figure out what he was doing as he was the only one that underwent hallucinations. A few moments later, from behind the crowd appeared Taryn's father and the village chief. As the chief had been told about Taryn's situation before, he knew the reason why Taryn was acting like that. The man said Taryn had killed off sacred snakes that were living in the abandoned house, thus he's being punished. Shortly afterwards, he surrounded Taryn in a circle of sand. Taryn, standing in the circle, somehow became weak, his limbs weary as he collapsed on the ground. Later the boy was taken to his room. His mom had to stay up all night watching him as he had gone down with fever. His face was filled with sheer horror. It looked like the pit of snakes still haunted him in his dream. I was amazed to see a layer of skin appearing on both Taryn's arm and face. It looked like that of a snake. It was until the skin peeled off that Taryn was fully recovered from his illness. Ever since that day, Taryn had become very fearful and timid. Even a small caterpillar could easily scare him.
This thrilling story happened before I was even born. I later heard from my grandmother that my grandfather was still very young at that time. The whole family lived in a small village. My grandfather was probably about 13 years old then. My grandfather's name was Shan, and he had an honest disposition. One day, Mr. Shan was asked by his father, my great-grandfather, to deliver cakes to an acquaintance. On the way back, Mr. Shan suddenly saw something glimmering on the side of the road. That was also the first time my grandfather saw the strange thing. My grandfather crept along the grass to take a closer look inside. It turned out that the thing that flashed was a big snake with its whole body in a pure white color. Its eyes were bloodshot, but for some reason, it just lay there unresponsive. Looking closer, the snake still had a lot of blood. It looked tired and exhausted. Although seeing a snake with such a strange color for the first time, he was a bit scared. Mr. Shan still used a dry wooden branch and tried to touch it. It just lay there and had no intention of attacking my grandfather. So with his honesty, he decided to help the snake. Mr. Shan carefully lifted the snake with a branch, then slowly put it into a basket. He didn't even forget to put a cloth over it, afraid that other people would be afraid to stop him. Mr. Shan was careful, moving little by little, carrying the heavy basket home. He thought long and hard and decided to go to the kitchen. Looking around, Mr. Shan saw a large jar in the corner of the kitchen. It was his home's water storage jar for when it rained. This jar was the only one big enough to hold the snake. For some reason, he felt a connection with the animal. It was also very gentle, not intending to attack him. After putting it in the jar of water, he did not forget to tell it to be obedient there before closing the lid. And so, in the days that followed, he took great care of the white snake. In the countryside, each family had a few hens that lay eggs. Every day he would sneak out and get some eggs for the snake. He was caught by his mother many times, but he still tried to hide the fact that he kept a snake in the house. Every day my great-grandmother wondered why the eggs in the barn kept disappearing, strangely enough. She thought it might be because the hens refused to lay eggs. But Mr. Shan did not even notice his mother. He still tried to take care of this beloved animal. Every day a few eggs would be taken so that the snake would gradually heal its wound. One day, like every other day, my grandfather ran as fast as he could into the kitchen, hiding some eggs in his shirt. However, when he opened the lid of the water jar, he was extremely alarmed because the beloved snake he had worked so hard to take care of for nearly 2 months had disappeared. In the jar, now only the eggshells were left. Mr. Shan burst into tears, not wanting to make his parents know what was happening. A few years later, he accidentally saw that the old white snake had returned, and it seemed to be much bigger, but the snake never appeared completely.
It only peeked behind objects in the house. Even my great-grandmother saw it appear on the ceiling several times. She was a little worried, not knowing what purpose a snake had coming back here. So during a meal, my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather had a discussion about the snake. She said that it appeared more and more in the house and it was getting bigger and bigger. She was afraid that something bad would happen. My great-grandfather didn't think so. He decided to bring some cake after dinner and went to find a famous shaman in the village to ask him about this matter. After arriving at the place, my great-grandfather narrated the incident to the shaman. The shaman also pondered for a long time, pressing something incomprehensible in his hand. In the end, he said this thing was a great blessing and not a bad thing or a bad omen at all. After listening to him, my great-grandfather was delighted and asked the shaman for more details. The shaman said snakes were sentient beings, and this snake was not an ordinary snake. The snake decided to follow my grandfather and bless him, so the shaman asked my great-grandfather to come home and build a small altar for the snake. After that, my great-grandfather did a good job. The crop was abundant and the snake rarely appeared in the house. A long time after that, my grandfather's family also made an unexpected fortune, building the most spacious house in the village. The whole family wondered if it was related to the snake or not. At the time, my grandfather was also an adult and married. His work and study path were also extremely favorable. That year, unfortunately, bandits from the mountain would often come down to the village to disturb the peace and plunder. They did not stop there. They would even kill innocent villagers. Because they were in a remote area, bandits hardly respected anyone, and of course, the place they were aiming for was my grandfather's house, since the house looked the biggest in the village. There were bound to be plenty of things for them to rob, they thought. After a few minutes of probing, bandits decided to ride their horses and stormed inside. Big strong horses broke through the gate. They used guns to shoot many times into the night sky, making everyone afraid. They then arrested Mr. Shan's family and threatened them with guns. Although Mr. Shan was angry, there was nothing he could do. Mr. Shan got angry and told the bandits they could take everything in the house but leave his family alone. After hearing this, the bandits showed a proud smile. But of course, they were a bunch of bottomless feeders with greed. The bandits not only wanted to rob, but also saw that my grandmother was beautiful at that time, so they desired her. Seeing the bandits touching his wife, my grandfather tried to resist and shoved his hand away, but only received a blow from hell. Then one of them overpowered him with a gun, and two more forced my grandmother and another female into a room. Seeing his wife being bullied without being able to do anything, my grandfather became angry. He held and cursed at them for being assholes. But they seemed to feel proud about it. One of the bandits would hit him on the head with the handle of a gun, causing him immense pain. They felt that he had a lot of annoying words to say, so they surrounded him and kicked him repeatedly with their feet. Because of an honest farmer like Mr. Shan, he could only hold his head in battle. Suddenly, from inside the room, a high-pitched scream made the bandits outside also stop in their tracks. Then, the bandit who forced my grandmother into the room was pushed out by something so strongly that he flew through the air as well as the window. The other bad guys gathered around him and saw that his whole body seemed to be crumbling and becoming horribly deformed. This scene made the rest of them start to panic because, of course, women couldn't do this to a man. They gathered and raised their guns in defense and then slowly entered the room. They carefully opened the door and gently stepped inside because they knew that the normal person couldn't break another one's limbs so easily. The villagers around now dared to approach and help my grandfather up. His face was covered in blood and he didn't know what was happening inside his house. Another scream rang out, and my grandmother and the maid rushed out and were not heard at all. My grandfather, Mr. Shun, insisted that his wife would be beside him. My grandmother was still scared, but she also told him that a large white snake had appeared and killed all the bandits. That's right, the old white snake had returned. Now it was a large monster. It must have been more than 10 meters long. It used its tail to wrap tightly around the necks of the bandits, breaking their bones. When the villagers and my grandfather heard everything was quiet, they dared to come in and see the bandits' bodies lying across the floor. Everyone teamed up to dig a hole next to the forest and bury the bandits. Then, I heard my grandmother tell me that when my grandfather was old and sick and near death, he saw a young man appear in front of him. The young man was tall and had white hair and a pale skin. The young man said that he was the white snake. He explained that he was the one who was saved by my grandfather and in return wanted to protect my grandfather's family for the rest of his life. So, its altar was preserved by my grandparents and passed on to descendants. To this day, I still light incense to give thanks.
It was a strange story that happened that made my whole village stir and bewildered for a long time. The story happened on a day in late summer, early autumn, when my whole village sank into the inherent peace. There was a family that encountered a bad thing. At that time, the wife was busy preparing food in the kitchen. Suddenly, realizing that the vegetables were running out, then she asked her husband to go down to the warehouse to pick more vegetables. The husband listened to his wife's words, leisurely entered the house, smoked a cigarette, and walked towards the warehouse. Since then, his family had lived by farming, so the house always built a warehouse to store harvested vegetables. Usually the family's food reserves were kept in a secret cellar that only family members knew. This thing was a habit that had been passed down through generations in the house. As usual, the husband went straight to the mouth of the tunnel, slowly crouched down. He opened the lid, looked inside and briefly checked it because it was a place to store food, but few people frequented it, so there were often rats and a few reptiles living there. After feeling safe, the husband followed the vertical ladder placed close to the foundation and went down to the basement. The whole basement without light became extremely dark, but it made few strange noises that made the husband curious and look around. As soon as he arrived, he immediately panicked because he saw a flock of colorful poisonous snakes wiggling on the ground, eyes wide open looking at him. The husband had never seen the strange snake before, so he panicked and shouted and clung to the ladder, looking for a way up. The snake saw the husband run away and immediately chased after him. They slithered in long rows close to his heels, causing him to panic, constantly calling his wife to help. The wife heard her husband's voice, immediately put aside the cooking, hurriedly ran to her husband to check it out. Looking at the panicked expression on her husband's face, the wife felt extremely worried, and then asked him about what had happened. Even though the husband had reached a safe place, he was still afraid in his heart. He kept telling his wife that he encountered a herd of snakes under the basement, surprising her. The wife found it hard to understand because there had been no snake that could sneak into the family's basement since then. To be sure, she also actively went to the place to check. The husband immediately stepped back and pointed to the mouth of the basement, which had not yet been closed. He told his wife to calm down because the number of snakes below was many, possibly up to a dozen. The wife was very confident at first, but when she approached the mouth of the basement, she heard a noise below and began to feel uneasy in her heart. She cautiously looked down at the mouth of the basement to check if there were snakes like her husband said. Indeed, the scene unfolding before her eyes made her scream. With her own eyes she had seen the small snakes squirming together in the dark basement, which she did not know before. Not only that, but these snakes are also very aggressive. The snakes saw the wife looking at them, immediately jumped up, bared their venomous fangs to scare the wife into shock. The husband saw that and went to his wife, hugged her. Both of them thought together about how to deal with the crowded snakes below. The husband was very reckless at first, curled up his sleeves and then went straight to the basement, wanting to catch each snake by himself. The wife saw this and immediately went to stop her husband for fear that he was in danger. After that she pondered for a while and then asked her husband to light a large torch to bring in. The husband listened to his wife, immediately went out and turned back with a big torch. When he reached the mouth of the basement, the husband threw the burning torch down from above, burning down dozens of snakes below. The light from the fire on the torch illuminated the entire basement, revealing the space inside. From the bottom rose a thick smoky grey smoke with an unpleasant odor. The higher the smoke rose, the more it would change into a thick grey black, as big as a large tornado, creeping through the door frames of the house, flying out and disappearing into the air. After the smoke cleared, the couple hugged each other and crept back to the basement to check the movement, but everything seemed to have become quieter. The husband slowly looked down. At this time, the husband breathed a sigh of relief and told his wife everything was fine. He did not see a snake anymore. After everything was resolved, the husband immediately told his wife to continue her work and he would go down to the basement to pick up food for his wife. The husband had just arrived at the place. The worry about the snakes earlier rose in him. The husband saw this, immediately looked for a wooden stick and then slowly went deep, his eyes constantly looking around. The sound of his footsteps echoed throughout the basement, creating an uncomfortably tense atmosphere. He carefully checked every nook and cranny of the basement so as not to miss a single snake. Suddenly, he was caught by a rustling sound. He walked to the source of the sound, raised a wooden stick, held it tightly and slowly walked over to check. As he approached, the husband saw a large white snake curled up in the corner of the room, hiding behind the family's food baskets. The husband saw the scene and panicked and shouted. Reflexively, he kept raising the wooden stick and slamming it down. In the first hit, the white snake was fortunate to dodge, but on the second hit, the wooden stick hit the white snake's head, causing red blood to splash. The snake then lay dead on the ground, surrounded by the blood that made the husband dumbfounded. He looked in horror at the snake's large body lying in front of him and quickly handled it, then turned back up. At this time, he felt tired in his body, so he went to bed to rest. But in the evening, the husband kept lying on the bed no matter how much his wife and children called. He refused to get up to eat. The husband stayed like that until the following morning, making his wife feel both strange and worried. The wife planned to go to the market to buy some things, but she felt insecure as soon as she got out of the house. She decided to return home immediately, running into the room to wake the husband up. After a while, when the husband did not answer, the wife jerked the blanket off to check. At this time, the wife panicked when she saw her husband lying motionless on the bed with his body curled up like a snake, looking very scary. The wife saw the horror scene and screamed and quickly ran out. Suddenly, she remembered her husband's story of killing snakes and thought of an idea. So, she went to invite the best magician in the village to come to help her heal her husband. she alone brought the magician into the house. As soon as the magician reached the courtyard, his heart suddenly appeared a sense of uneasiness. He followed the wife into the bedroom to check. The wife did not expect the situation to become so serious. Based on the celestial eye, the magician saw the spirit of the white snake wrapping around the husband's body, waiting for the day to eat the meat. The magician did not rush to conclusions, so he turned to ask the wife if there were snakes in the house recently. Hearing that, the wife also nodded to confirm. She told the story about the snakes in the basement yesterday to the magician. After listening, the magician sighed, saying that the family had accidentally killed the white snake, a dangerous snake. When the wife heard it, she panicked, cried, and begged the magician to save the life of her husband and the whole family. The magician saw that the wife was also pitiful, so he immediately thought of a way to help this poor family. After pondering for a while, the magician also told the wife that the white snake was very angry now. It was difficult to forgive her and her husband, but there was only one way that could help them. So the magician asked the wife to lead him down to the basement where the white snake and his children had lived to build an altar. The wife was busy helping the magician with a hand, preparing a large respectful altar to apologize to the white snake. The magician, after preparing the altar, also began to bless and worship and then left. Before leaving, he still did not forget to instruct the wife every year on this day to celebrate the death anniversary of the white snake and regularly worship and beg for the white snake to forgive her sins. The husband soon regained consciousness, but his spirit was broken and weak. Listening to his wife tell everything, he was also very repentant, going to the white snake altar alone to apologize. Since then, the food storage basement in the house has become a place to worship the white snakes, and the altar is always full of incense and food.
This scary story revolves around Mr. Hero and Miss Cho's family. Due to bankruptcy, they had to move back to their hometown in order to make a living. The family moved in their late uncle's house, which had been left abandoned for years. It was a spring morning with fresh air when they started a new life at their new home. The house had been deserted for a long time. However, Hero and Cho felt blessed as they still had a place to stay. It wasn't an easy task to find a house this good without having to pay any cent, especially in these times of crisis. This was truly a blessing for Hero and his family. No sooner had Chow stepped into the house than she venerated her late uncle's altar. She had left her hometown for a long time. As a result, she had a pang of guilt on her return. Cho and her family were just supposed to stay at this place for a short time, and would leave as soon as they could afford a new house. The couple had 2 children, the older one named Dosu and the little one named Diane. That day, as the 2 were taking a shower, they suddenly heard their dad screaming. The younger child instantly got out of his bathtub and went to see his father. As Dosu turned off the faucet, then ran behind him. Diane saw his dad pouring with sweat, looking to the direction of the bed while being terrified. The child then turned his gaze at the bed and instantly got scared. His face turned pale. His eyes were wide open as he gasped in fear. It turned out that there was a snake that looked really scary on the bed. As Dosu arrived later, he brought himself a shovel and immediately rushed to the snake as soon as he saw it. The boy let out a scream as he lifted the shovel, then hit the snake on its head. Blood was spilled and the snake was killed right after that. Opposite to the exciting look on Dosu's face, Mrs. Chow felt extremely worried about her son's actions as she believed the presence of the snake was a sign of bad luck. Hero used a stick to carry the dead snake outside. As everything seemed to have ended, what turned out next was completely out of their expectation. One afternoon, while the other two brothers were playing outside, it was unknown what Diane had witnessed, yet he dripped with sweat and trembled uncontrollably. The boy was in utter bewilderment for a few seconds. He pointed to something and muttered, "Snake! Snake!" Dosu was startled by what he heard. As he turned around, he saw a snake stretching its jaws, revealing its sharp teeth, which caused him to panic. Dosu reached to the shovel and hit the snake multiple times. As the snake was killed, he again used the shovel to brutally split it into small pieces. Right that moment, Miss Cho had just returned from the market. As Diane told her about the incident, her face became dark. She panicked. She wondered how could it be so coincidental to have so many snakes going into her house. Diane showed his mom the spot where his brother Dosu killed the snake. To Diane's amazement, the snake had mysteriously disappeared. The blood was still there, but it was no longer to be seen. How could it be possible, considered the fact that the snake had been chopped to pieces? Feeling shocked, Diane, together with his mom and Dosu, went to the spot where the snake had been killed. Diane was instantly scared to find out that the snake had gone. He stammered as cold sweat ran down his face. Sensing something terrible, the mother reassured her children and took them back to their rooms, then went to the altar room. Dosu had turned 15 this year. He was mature enough to have questions about his mom's bizarre behavior. He wondered why his mom said the snakes had something to do with her late uncle. Dosu told Diane to go to the next room to see what their mom was doing. Diane looked inside the altar room through a window and quickly felt strange. His mother was burning incense sticks. She looked anxious. Then the woman muttered something under her breath as she pleaded for forgiveness for her two children. But what happened next instantly amazed her. The incense stick had been broken in half without being physically affected. This must be a sign that indicated the spirits had been upset. Chow totally panicked to see the incense being broken in half. She bowed to the altar of her two late uncles, but it looked like they weren't approving of her pleading for forgiveness. The next morning, a tragedy happened to the family. As it was still early in the morning, Diane unexpectedly let out a piercing scream. He rushed out of his room and went to his parents, telling them that his brother was acting strangely. The couple, terrified as they ran to check on their son, and saw Dosu writhing painfully on his bed. Miss Cho rushed to her son at that moment. Dosu was feeling an immense pain throughout his whole body. Out of nowhere appeared deep cuts on both Dosu's arms and legs. There was even blood oozing out of the wounds. The couple hurriedly took Dosu to the nearest clinic. But even the doctors were frowning in confusion, as they had never encountered a case of such a strange disease. Not only that, the cuts made Dosu wrestle with unbearable pain. It lasted longer than expected, and the wounds had no sign of healing. Thinking the situation his child got in had something to do with evils, Hiro went to ask his mom for help. Hiro's mom then asked a shaman in the village to come to her house. A while later, the shaman had finally showed up despite being a bit late. Hiro's mom quickly told the shaman to get inside and started telling him about her grandson's situation. The shaman said the incident needed to be handled soon, as its consequences would be dangerous. He also worried that Dosu wouldn't be able to put up with the pain for longer than 3 days. Hiro's mom said a grandchild had killed 2 snakes, as one of them had disappeared on that day. So she believed the snake had returned and taken revenge on her grandson. Having comprehended the whole story, the shaman told them to get him a gas stove, as he needed to make amulets. Hiro's mom said she would have it ready for him immediately. The shaman said the snakes were actually incarnations of the spirits in the house, and those who dared to kill them would definitely be punished. As the gas stove was on, the shaman took a bag of yellow papers and then burned them. Strangely, there was this envelope which didn't get burned, even just a bit. A few minutes later, the shaman put the envelope inside 2 voodoo dolls. According to the shaman, the 2 snakes that had been killed were actually Mrs. Cho's late uncle and his wife, and Dosu had been punished for killing them.
Now the shaman said he needed to make 2 voodoo dolls for the spirits to get inside, thus forgiving Dosu. Hiro and his mom couldn't hide the terror on their faces. They didn't expect Dosu would do such an awful thing. As the dolls and the amulets had been prepared, the shaman threw them in the fire to cast a spell. He then told Hiro to place the amulet bag onto the altar, and Dosu would instantly recover from his illness. What the shaman said turned out to be true, as 2 days later, Dosu was totally free from sickness and became healthy again. This story serves as a message to tell all of us not to kill sacred animals like snakes or butterflies, and those who dare to kill them would be punished severely. This happened to a friend of my dad's when he was a kid, and maybe for my dad, this was a part of a very horrifying memory. That friend's name was Lindo. Very talented and powerful in class because Lindo fully met the standards of a very good student. And he stood out the most, especially in sport. Almost everything about Lindo's strength training, he got the maximum results from it. There was sports festival or something. As long as he competed, he'd win first prize. In the sports world, Lindo seemed to have no rival. He was always the first to finish. No one could surpass Lindo. He was so strong on the track, like a beast. Lindo was like the school idol. Everyone at school admired him, saw him as an idol, and everyone wanted to play with him. Until bad things started to happen to him. He had a strange disease, and this disease seemed to have stolen everything from him. Lindo spent several days in the hospital. He looked so pale, emaciated. He had a tired look on his face. Lindo would probably stop playing sports for a while. My dad went to visit him. Everyone was very worried about him and his condition, and everyone was hoping that he would return to school soon. My dad said he didn't know what kind of illness Lindo had, but he kept looking at my dad like he didn't know him. He gave my dad a look with blank eyes that made him very sad. Then, when we heard that he was discharged from the hospital, my father came to visit him again. Because the two of them were very close to each other, they saw each other as close brothers, like a family. After being discharged from the hospital, he did not go to school, nor did he leave the house. He seemed to turn into a completely different person. When my dad visited him that day, Lindo was eating, but if he was just eating normally, there was nothing to talk about. Witnessing that scene, my father panicked. He was eating eggs, but the way of eating was very strange. Lindo didn't peel the egg. He didn't peel out the outer shell, and he immediately took the egg and shoved it into his mouth with shell and all. My father was really surprised. My dad didn't see Lindo chewing, but he was putting the egg straight into his mouth and swallowing it, and it was worse when it was a raw egg. His mother said that since being discharged from the hospital until now, he has not chewed anything but swallowed it whole, and especially raw eggs. The craving for raw eggs was getting worse. My dad sat next to me, but Lindo did not care or say anything. He ate 4 or 5 eggs at a time, absolutely raw. No one dared to play with him after Lindo got that strange disease, which made his mother very sad. After a long time, Lindo also gradually stabilized. He also looked fresher. Sometimes he even walked around the house with my father. But of course, another strange thing happened to Lindo, a sight that my father witnessed and which my father said he is still scared of to this day. When the weather was in late spring and early autumn, the gentle wind blew. bringing cool water vapor, and the leaves also began to fall, creating a charming landscape. But something wasn't right here. It was not the leaves falling on my father's shoulders, but the patches of skin falling from Lindo. What had just happened in front of his eyes made him extremely confused, because Lindo looked very scary and a little disgusting. At first, my father thought it was paper on the road that was blown away by the wind, but it turned out to be pieces of skin peeling off from Lindo's body. Not only on the neck, on the back of the neck, but all over Lindo's body, especially the face. Patches of human skin began to emerge and fall off. Lindo didn't even show any fear. He even tore the peeling skin off his entire arm like he was changing skin. After peeling the skin off of himself, he would hold the skin and play with it like a game, and this scared my dad to death. But something unexpected was happening to his skin while it was still intact after tearing off another layer of skin. Looking at him, he was happy and without fear. People in the village said that perhaps Lindo had some sort of skin disease. As long as he ate snake meat, he would recover, because this was a folk remedy that everyone knew. Lindo's mother asked a young man in the neighborhood who often caught snakes to sell to everyone in the village, and his mother asked for some snake meat to bring it home. But inexplicably, when he saw the plate of meat, Lindo froze when he saw each piece of snake smoking. He was still eating raw eggs. He suddenly changed his face. He looked panicked, and he immediately shoved the plate of snake meat away with his hand. He had no control over his emotions or behavior. He screamed loudly, and he then smashed everything like a crazy man, looking angry and wild. He was still not satisfied, so he went to the young snake catcher's house. Lindo's insults and curses were extremely malicious. He kept emitting obscenities. He cursed the young man to death. Although Lindo's temperament changed, my father often played with him whenever he had time, and sometimes he also chatted with my father. By the time they were 15 or 16, Lindo's body had grown, and his hair had started to grow a lot, but Lindo didn't like it. Once, when we were sitting and talking on the straw in front of the house, suddenly my father saw that Lindo was holding a pair of pliers. He said it was great to pull out the leg hairs with pliers, but the special thing was that he didn't feel any pain, but enjoyed it very much. Just when he was especially sober, Lindo said something to my dad. His words shocked my dad. "There's a snake living inside of me." Lindo began to remember and recount things that had happened to him. He said the other day, when Lindo was on his way home alone, he heard rustling in the grass across the street, which attracted him. It turned out that the sound was from a green snake. It was lying in the grass and leaving its body outside. The snake was also quite big. Lindo couldn't even know what was on his mind at that time. He just knew that when he saw the snake, he felt very interested and excited for some reason. A crazy thought popped into Lindo's head. Rather, this was a cruel thought. Lindo quickly raised his foot and trampled the snake to death. After that, Lindo said that he went home and strange things started happening that night. He slept and had a dream about a snake. Maybe it was because he killed it and then he had a nightmare. He saw a particularly large snake, or rather giant snake, that had entered his body for shelter. Lindo's family also suspected that he was possessed by some sort of snake demon, so they invited an exorcist to help him drive away the snake ghost. But to no avail. Lindo died before he was 40 years old, and every time my father came home, he would go to the village cemetery to visit his friend's grave. My father once asked his classmate about this. He said that maybe because Lindo killed the snake, it might have brought revenge on him, because snakes were inherently sacred. Lindo must have been bitten by a snake and it had possessed his soul. Now that's called retribution. But Lindo had no way out. This was a story that happened to me and my wife a few years ago. At the time, to secure a source of income for both of us was extremely challenging. When I won a big project, my wife and I immediately rented a small apartment to stay in temporarily. But since moving into the apartment, my wife often had nightmares. In the middle of the night, she kept waking up from a nightmare that kept repeating night by night. Because of lack of sleep, my wife fell seriously ill. I was curious, so I asked my wife about the dream she so often dealt with every night. My wife honestly recounted that every night she would see herself being chased by a group of people in the alleyway leading to an apartment complex. The road was dark, she couldn't see her surroundings clearly, and the air was extremely cold. My wife tried everything to be able to escape the strange pursuit, but could not get away. This group of people were very large. Their movements were also extremely agile. They were only a few feet away from our wife. Every time my wife turned her head to look, she saw a group of people with white eyes, black faces and sharp fangs chasing her as if trying to catch her, and always while having sinister smiles. They chased my wife into a large but old and dilapidated building. My wife felt this building had a familiarity since it looked like the building that my wife and I were renting, but the atmosphere was unusually cold and gloomy. Despite the chill that gnawed at her skin, my wife ran a long way to the middle of the building. She continued to run for a while when she hit a dead end. She had no choice but to hide behind a large plasterboard to distract the mysterious people. By the time the group of people could come, my wife was already hiding. Taking advantage of the time they were still busy looking for her, my wife slowly turned around, stepping out of the plaster wall to find a way of escaping. Hearing the footsteps, this group of people turned to look in that direction, seeing my wife escaping and then immediately chased after her. The sound of human footsteps echoed throughout the building with my wife's gasps and screams for help. My wife kept running and eventually found an abandoned room in a corner which was pitch black with no sight of what was inside, looking both mysterious and dangerous. My wife struggled to look around, wanting to find herself some light glimmering in this dark space, but she didn't know which way to go. Seeing that the group of people was about to catch up with her, she took a risk and entered the room to hide. My wife huddled in the dark room. Her whole body trembled from fear and the cold air inside. She only knew how to hold her breath and pray for the group of people not to find her. Suddenly, at that moment, behind my wife came the sound of footsteps rushing towards her. After a while, the group of people also found my wife. They immediately looked inside and looked at my wife, causing my wife to panic, jumping all over her and screaming. They rushed to each other, surrounding my wife. They reached out their hands as if to grab my wife and take her away. My wife was very scared, trying to find a way to escape, but now she couldn't move anymore. My wife's whole body paused as if frozen. She could only raise her hand to cover her face and scream for help, but got no response. She finally woke up. Since then, my wife's health had deteriorated. She often fell ill. But even so, she still tried to take good care of me so that I didn't have to worry too much. I had to go to the construction site early every day to start work. The first stage was to dig the ground layer to start building the foundation, so the work was hard. As a deputy manager, I had a lot of work to do. I had to supervise the work progress of the workers here on behalf of my superiors. The workers here worked extremely hard to be able to hand over the project on time. I often stood outside and constantly urged workers at the construction site to work harder and faster. The atmosphere here was extremely tense. While the workers were busy digging up the ground, I walked around the workplace alone. Unknowingly, I saw a small snake being covered by a layer of ground all over its body. It looked so pitiful. I immediately ordered the excavator to stop working and find a tree branch on the side of the road to help this little snake out. I let the snake wrap itself around the branch and gently carried it to a safer place. I found a long lawn lying on the side of the construction site. I felt that the place was also quite stable, so I released the small snake. I stood still by the grass, watching the small snake creeping through the weeds and disappearing into the deep forest as I breathed a sigh of relief. After successfully rescuing the poor little snake, I immediately told the workers to continue their work, not forgetting to instruct them to stay aware, in order to avoid the same case as the small snake. Finally, I happily returned to the worksite. For some reason, after releasing the snake back to its wildlife, I felt extremely relieved. That afternoon, I was also able to get home from work early. I had dinner with my wife happily. My wife's body had also reduced her fever a lot. That night, my wife also slept better than usual. But in the middle of the night, my wife was once again shocked awake. Her face was tired and haunted, not the horror like the previous days, making me extremely surprised. My wife said that she continued to have the same nightmare as usual. But this time, in the dream appeared a strange thing that helped her escape the pursuit of the mysterious people pursuing her. My wife saw that the mysterious group of people continued to chase her down the familiar dark corridor. This time she got used to the ways here, so she quickly found the old room to hide in once again. Like the previous nights, these people once again found her hiding in the room. They rushed in again as if to pull her out and take her away. These people had become more aggressive than before. They pressed her to the end, they climbed through the window and entered the room to capture her. She screamed in panic for a while when a huge shadow appeared, biting at the people here like a monster. It wasn't until this huge creature came in front of the room that my wife could see it clearly. It was a big, yellow snake that acted very aggressively. This huge snake tried to protect my wife. It consumed all those monstrous ghosts with one bite and swallowed them whole. These people, some of them who were wrapped tightly by the snake's tail, were eaten alive, looking horrific. In the blink of an eye, these monstrous ghosts had completely disappeared. After consuming all the ghosts, the huge snake appeared in front of my wife. It looked at her gently, moved its head to signal peacefully to her, then turned to the other way. My wife also inadvertently understood the meaning of the huge snake. She followed the snake to find her way back. When my wife got out of the building, she saw an empty lot. The houses here had been abandoned for a long time, ruined and very lonely. After bringing my wife to a safe place, the snake turned into nearby wild grass and then slithered through the grass, gradually disappearing. After a while, a white light appeared, shining directly on my wife's face, causing her to wake up. After listening to my wife's story, according to her description, I realized that the snake that saved her life was the little snake that I saved at the construction site. I reassured my wife with a few sentences and then told her the story about the snake I saved at work. My story made her breathe a sigh of relief. Since then, my wife had not had that strange nightmare anymore. My project was also executed smoothly and way faster than planned. At police headquarters 703, the whole team was busy with new cases, primarily petty thefts that happened regularly in town. Even boss Liu Feng did not have time to rest. He sat down to review the murders. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. The person who came in was Captain Chow. He reported to his boss Liu Feng about the disappearance of many people recently in the mountainous area. Immediately, boss Liu Feng ordered Captain Chow to prepare the entire team for the scene quickly. It was a severe case, so they could not take it lightly. Team 1 was ready to go to the scene. The incident was in a mountainside area next to town, so it didn't take a long time to get there. When they arrived, they knew that the person reporting the crime was a middle-aged man. His face was panicked and extremely scared when he said that his family members told him to go fishing but did not come back. He led the team to where his relatives said they would go and cast their nets to catch fish, but disappeared. The water surface was relatively calm at this time. Boss Lu Feng and everyone felt the surrounding air was full of the smell of death. This lake was quite big and looked very deep, and there were almost no fish because the lake's surface was tranquil without a ripple. It seemed very strange. Boss Lu Feng asked a man when this lake existed. The man said that this lake just appeared recently, but this was the old chemical factory area. Immediately, Boss Lu Feng ordered the team to take measurements and look around this lake. Previously, this area was a chemical factory serving the army. After a landslide, this lake was also formed. Boss Lu Feng then ordered the police officers to get ready to dive to the bottom of the lake to investigate. At the command of Captain Chow, they would dive to the lake's bottom to find the missing people. They would bring knives to protect themselves. After hearing the signal clearly, they began to plunge into the water, led by Captain Chow. The water of this lake was always calm without a ripple. Everyone in Boss Lu Feng stood on it waiting for news from Captain Chow. As for Captain Chow, after diving, he quickly reached the bottom of the lake, which was relatively deep. He glanced around at the bottom of the lake. It seemed that this lake had subsided and formed not long ago because the lake's soil had not yet wholly turned into mud, and the pieces of bricks and stones built by the people before were still very much left. Captain Chow continued to swim around to check. The light down here seemed very weak. Suddenly he saw something blurry in the distance. He decided to swim closer and discovered something which appeared to be someone's body. But why didn't it float on the water? Come to think of it, Captain Chow swam there quickly to see the situation. But when he swam closer to the place, he was amazed at what was in front of his eyes. At the bottom of the lake was a dead man, gripped by something, like the tentacles of a giant octopus. The strange thing was that even though he had been drowning for many days, the man's skin did not swell and looked like it had been sucked out of nutrients. Captain Chow was about to go over to see what had wrapped the man when something appeared beside him. It turned out to be another giant tentacle. It approached him from behind. He quickly glanced to see more clearly. That tentacle also had a lot of fangs sprouting out, looking scary. Right now, from below, similar tentacles began to appear, and the terrible thing finally came to Captain Chow. A series of other tentacles gradually appeared from the bottom of the lake. At that time, Captain Chow hastily turned his head and swam to the surface to escape. But unexpectedly, those tentacles were so fast, they grabbed his legs. Sharp fangs clung to his flesh, causing him terrible pain. It began to tear pieces of flesh from his leg as if it was food. Captain Chow reached out his hand to cut it off with a knife, but other tentacles surrounded him, wrapping around his arm. Fortunately, his teammates arrived in time to rescue him, cutting off those hideous tentacles. When the tentacles were severed, it spewed out a monstrous black liquid. The teammates were finally able to bring Captain Chow to the surface, free from the monster. Seeing that Captain Chow was seriously injured, his boss Lu Feng asked why, and was also very worried about him. Chow was panting now, reporting a giant monster below which had taken other victims to eat. What's more frightening, Captain Chow's condition was quite bad at that time. The places where those tentacles wrapped, the meat there was swollen like it was rotting. Both Captain Chow's legs and arms were starting to give off the stench of washed meat, and the pain was excruciating. After listening to his teammates' report about the incident at the bottom of the lake, Boss Lu Feng immediately ordered the team to prepare to drain all the water out of this lake. The whole team deployed the plan to destroy the monster instantly. In a few moments, the large capacity equipment used to draw water was delivered and ready to start draining. Many pumps were sucking the water below out of the lake. Boss Lu Feng and teammates were also waiting impatiently for what was in the lake after all. Because the lake was too deep, it took a long time to drain, and the sun began to set shortly. And the police officers also came to report to Boss Lu Feng that the lake water had been exhausted. As soon as they witnessed what was in front of them, the whole team was terrified. A monster or something terrifying appeared in front of them. It was huge. Its body was only made up of long tentacles and full of sharp fangs. It looked like a giant octopus, but that had no body part apart from the tentacles. Like tentacles growing from the ground, its tentacles so tightly wrapped the bodies of people who were thought to be missing. Their bodies were drained of their blood and dried up like mummies. The policemen grabbed their guns and started shooting at the monster because it had killed so many people. It must be destroyed. The bullets fired continuously at the tentacles, causing the monster to be injured and writhing in pain. Because it was so painful, it released the dead people on the tentacles, and the policemen took the opportunity to bring the dead people ashore. Then Boss Lu Feng ordered the implementation of Plan B. Large tanks of gasoline were prepared in advance and poured into the lake's bottom one by one. It seemed that Boss Lu Feng wanted to cook this giant octopus. They quickly poured gasoline down to drench the monster. Boss Lu Feng calmly pulled out a box of matches from his pocket and he began to light a match. Standing on high, he directly threw the match on the monster, and no one would be harmed by it again. Immediately the monster was on fire. It was in pain and writhed continuously with its tentacles. Its tentacles quickly burned away and its fangs slowly burned black and fell apart. Before long, the monster turned into a disgusting pile of black ash, and from the slime came a terrible stench like the smell of rotting meat, making everyone nauseous. After the monster was dead, the police officers were ordered to go down to the lake's bottom to look around. At the lake's bottom, scattered with many human bones, all the disappearances in the area were caused by it. Then Boss Lu Feng ordered the lake to be filled with soil. Finally, after dealing with the monster, the police returned the victims' bodies to their families. Also, they collected all the bones that were not intact for forensic examination to check the victims' identification. Boss Lu Feng also returned to the headquarters to review the case file. Captain Chow was seriously injured, but his bones were not affected, and he was treated promptly. Although the wound has not healed, Captain Chow had also rushed back to work. He did not want to miss the cases. He brought his boss Lu Feng a report on the case of a giant man-eating octopus. This octopus had mutated and lived underneath the abandoned chemical factory. When the lake was formed, it was also when it emerged and resided below. The case was quickly closed, and this case was also listed as top secret. After this case, Captain Chow was rewarded for his bravery. However, there were still many strange cases ahead waiting for Captain Chow.